Welcome, everybody. We are delighted to have you on behalf of the Board of Trustees and the staff of the National Museum of Bermuda. Thank you for joining us for this third presentation in our Tracing Our Roots or Routes program. Thanks to the generous funding and support by our community of donors, individuals, foundations, and corporations, and all of our membership who enable us to present this program free and accessible to all. My name is Lisa Howie. I'm the Director of Learning and Engagement at the museum, and I'm the moderator for this event. I also want to give a shout out and thanks to the team behind the scenes who are working hard to develop engaging programs, maintain the museum collections and grounds, and sustain the future. If you love the program and the overall good work of the museum, please don't be shy. Please become a member today, and you can donate through our website, nmb.bm. Please be aware, everyone, that the session is being recorded and post-editing will be available on the National Museum of Bermuda website. We also welcome your critical feedback. So please be sure to complete our brief survey that we will put into the chat at the end of the presentation, and hope that you will click through to that and save it to go back to at the end in order to give us some good feedback. Everyone should be aware that having registered on the website, you see already that there are the recordings from the previous presentations and also those previous toolkits. I do hope that those are useful for you and that you are able to share those with your family and friends. I noticed that our staff member, Deb Atwood, has put the survey link into the chat. So if you would like to click that and save that, that'd be terrific. Please use the Q&A when we get to Q&A and at the end of the presentations, and then and use the chat for any information you wish to share or any tech issues that you might be experiencing. And the chat, of course, is also there for all of us to listen to each other, so feel free to use that as you wish to. So the Tracing Our Routes program really is connected to two key questions. Where does your story begin, and what legacy does it unfold? This program emerges from the community's interest in genealogy, and our intention is that we want to give you the strategies and resources to research and document your family history, and we hope help you to make new connections with your past. In February and March, we presented 2 workshops on the journey of family discovery. And as I just mentioned, each has its own accompanied toolkit, and those are on our website. In June, we will be featuring Dr. Janet Ferguson, a National Museum of Bermuda trustee and education specialist, and she'll be crafting a personal story. And that topic is a really nice segue from today's presentation, where Dr. Ferguson will help us to craft and care for the narratives and stories that you have discovered on your journey. In July, we will feature an on-site contemporary art exhibition by Jerde Hassel, and her project will explore the theme to the program in a very physical and engaging way at the museum. The program will culminate with a crowdsourced exhibit called Bermuda's Family Scrapbook. It's the way in which you can tie together your experience from joining us in February and then submitting a story and an image of an object or an image of your family. And that will ultimately be gathered and exhibited on display at the museum. So what's very interesting about this program is while you're doing individual research, looking into yourself, your family's history and story, we will then be asking you to share one important element with us to allow us to share in each other's story and really see ourselves together and within the museum space. So our overall aim through the program is that we will help you to develop the tools to research your family history, to take you as far as you wish to go. And by having the resources online, you can always go back to them for further information. We're hoping that, like today, that you'll listen to the stories of our presenters for both guidance and inspiration, and perhaps from today also develop creative strategies for communicating your findings and your family story. Our overall goal is to assist and encourage you to explore honor, and preserve your family history. We all have that shared responsibility to sort of carry the torch along for each of our previous family members. So, turning to today, our topic, as you well know, is personal journeys and personal objects, the development of the National Museum of African American History and Culture's collection. Our panelists are Joanne Hipplet from the National Museum of African American History and Culture. We have Hollis Gentry from the Smithsonian Libraries. And we also have Doretha Williams and Camila Stinnett from the Robert Frederick Smith Explore Your Family History Center. Bit of a mouthful. This session with these experts from the Smithsonian Institution will explore how curators work with objects that come into the museum collection. How do they know what they know, and how do they verify this information? They're also going to be presenting and discussing how genealogists and museum specialists work together to research and dive deeper into the often complex history and histories of the object makers. We'll also be looking at how community outreach and community involvement can play a fundamental role in the development of a museum narrative or intention, and how communities can also engage with and learn from museum archives. So we've got a lot on the plate. I hope that if you've got your notebook out, you're ready to take some notes. Otherwise, to sit back and enjoy. I'm going to introduce each speaker. We have four, and then each speaker will present, and then I'll introduce the next speaker. As you have your questions, again, please feel free to put those into the chat. So we're going to speak a little bit quickly about Joanne Hipplet. She is a PhD. She's the supervisory museum curator of the African diaspora at the National Museum of African American History and Culture. She's the curator of the Cultural Expressions inaugural exhibition at that museum and the co-curator of A Century in the Making, Building the National Museum of African American History and Culture. Dr. Hipplet's expertise and interests are in diasporic cultural expressions and Black immigrant American community histories. So without further ado, I'd like to please pass over to Joanne and enjoy.
Thank you, Lisa, for that introduction. And I'd also like to thank the National Museum of Bermuda for the opportunity and the invitation to be part of the Tracing Our Roots series. The importance of tracing roots, whether that's spelled with an OU or a double O, is definitely something that Black Americans in the United States share with Bermudians and other places that have descendants of the transatlantic slave trade. Because the United States has also been a destination for successive migrations of people from the Caribbean for multiple generations, we also share an interest in tracing our roots back to these spaces, which are not as far back, but can also be just as complex and complicated to figure out. The first part of this presentation is a joint one between my colleague, Hollis Gentry, who you'll hear speak after me, and myself. My portion of the presentation is directed at the question, how do we know what we know in museums? On this next screen, and I'll wait for it to appear, you'll see the tagline for the National Museum of African American History and Culture, which is a people's history, a people's journey, a nation's story. And I'm starting with it because it picks up on some important themes for tonight's session on personal objects, personal stories. Our museum is ultimately about people and people's stories. We interpret American history through the lens of African American people. Unlike university scholars who do the same thing in their classrooms for their students or through journal articles and books, and unlike filmmakers who interpret Black history using movies, museums interpret history through the objects, and these objects can be both 3D or 2D, that were part of people's lives. They also interpret them through the objects that surrounded them during their lifetimes. On the next slide, you'll see a selection of a number of objects that have become part of our more than 36,000 object collection. Over 50% of our objects in our collection were donated to us by individuals, families, and collectors. And each one of these objects has a personal story behind it. And in many cases, there are two stories behind it. There's a story behind the object, and sometimes the story behind the donor who gave it to us. So I'll point out a few of those. At the top left, there's the Nat Turner Bible. Nat Turner was in lead of a major slave rebellion in Virginia, really believed that his mission to end enslavement was given to him by God. So obviously the artifact of having a Bible is really important for us, really relevant to his storyline. But also just as important is the story of the donor who gave it to us. There was a family who had held on to the Bible. They had an ancestor who had actually passed away as part of that rebellion, and they thought it was very important for us to have it. At the bottom, there's the address by Anne Lowe. Anne Lowe was a major designer. She broke the color barrier in the mainstream fashion world in the 1950s and was designing for all types of people at the time when in a very segregated America, when Black fashion designers had very little opportunity. The donor of this gown is actually the founder of a museum, she's passed away since then, a museum called the Black Fashion Museum. And she left us over 2,000 garments related to Black fashion designers and Black fashion histories and trusted us with their care. There are the shards from the 16th Street Baptist Church, the bombing that people picked up afterwards. There's the Edisto Island slave cabin, which the community donated to us. There's all of the artifacts in terms of hats and store sign related to May Reeves' shop in Philadelphia. Each one of these objects has a personal history behind it. And together they help us tell a larger story about culture, about Black cultures, and about our nation. Museums are also widely considered authoritative sources. Studies conducted in the United States have shown that people consider museums to be experts, and in a world of alternative facts and implicit biases, they consider museums to be more credible than sources such as newspapers. Now, there's a lot that can be said about how true or not this is, but regardless of the facts, the data shows that people trust museums to provide them with accurate information and to tell them the truth. At the National Museum of African American History and Culture, we also did our own market research studies when the museum was conceptualized. Back in 2000, 2007, 2008, 8 years before we opened, we went out to the public and we asked them, how should we tell the story of African American history and culture? And resoundingly, they told us, tell the unvarnished truth. Tell the difficult stories, no matter how hard it is, don't water it down. So that's the mission that we carry with us as staff members at the museum. For this reason, it's very important that before a curator such as myself puts an object on display, we have to know what the history behind it is and do as much research as possible to verify the information we're able to gather. We do that through several steps and several processes. A curator may identify an object and bring it into the collection, or an object may be offered to us for donation, and in which case we review it. So someone comes to us with an object, or we identify an object that we want for the collection. Our first step is to research its provenance, which really is, summed up, is its personal history, to figure out who made this object, how it came into the possession of the person who has it now, who else had it in their possession at different points in time, what is it made of. We do a lot of research to establish some very core facts. We then try to verify its provenance. A really good example of that is a few years ago, someone came to us with Zora Neale Hurston, the great writer Zora Neale Hurston's graduation gown from Barnard, which she had sold to a fellow student. We couldn't find any sort of history about that within Zora Neale Hurston's work and books herself. So we had to do other types of work to sort of verify the gowns. We did research looking at what Barnard gowns were during that period of time. We had a textile conservator come and look at it and tell us if it was authentic to that particular period of time. There are lots of different strategies we use to at least get some core facts in place before we decide to bring something into the collection. After we do make that decision, even afterwards, we're still conducting ongoing research because we can't do it all before it becomes part of the collection. We need enough to verify that the story that we're learning about the police is true. And then we do a lot of other research on the back end to continue doing more work on it. So on the next slide, you'll see that that's the exhibition slide for the Cultural Expressions exhibition. I'm the curator at that exhibition, which is located on the 5th floor of our museum. Cultural Expressions explores 5 different ways in which Americans express culture. Now, there are dozens of objects in cultural expressions, and each one tells a story about a person, a place, or a tradition that they're linked to. There's a scrapbook by a woman named Harriet Bell Wells, who was part of the Wiley College debate team, the first debate team to participate in interracial debate in the South. There is the ironwork, a gate made by blacksmith Philip Simmons, who was responsible for beautifying so much of the South Carolina landscape. There's a metal pot used to cook greens at the Florida Avenue Grill, which bills itself as the oldest soul food restaurant in the world. And all of these artifacts share personal stories that in turn inform us about larger Black cultures and their cumulative contributions to our nation. Today, as part of this presentation, Hollis and I are actually going to be focusing on one person's story who was also in the Cultural Expressions exhibition. That's right. And that is artist and craftsman Art Smith, whose life illustrates the type of information our museum is most interested in and how we at museums come to know what we know. So who was Art Smith? You'll see some photographs of him there on the slide, and you may be able to tell from these photographs that he was a jeweler. So the left photograph, you'll see him very young, at his young age, bending metal wires into shape. In the middle, he's middle-aged, and he's showcasing his famous spiral necklace. And in the third photograph, all the way to the right, he is at home and he's wearing two of his pieces of jewelry, a necklace called the Ellington necklace and a ring, which is kind of hard to see in the photograph. Art Smith was specifically, you can go back to the previous slide, yeah. Art Smith was specifically a modernist jeweler. He was born in 1917 and passed away in 1982. The mid-century modernist jewelry movement dates roughly from the 1940s to the 1970s, and he was involved in it during that entire period, from his early 30s to his death in 1960, into his death at the age of 65. His work appears in the artistry, craftsmanship, and creativity section of the exhibition. And on the next couple of screens, you'll see examples of his work. I'll give you a little time to digest them. So you can go to the next one. These awesome, incredible bracelets, the lava cuff, the modern cuff down at the bottom. And you also see the stamp that is on all of his pieces of jewelry. And then on the next slide, you'll see some of his amazing necklaces. He's the only Black person known to have participated in the mid-century modernist jewelry movement. The bracelets and necklace that you've just seen on screen are great examples of Art Smith's works, which are sculptural, dynamic, and often large in scale, but also highly functional and adaptive. His jewelry was made to fit and move with the body. And in fact, we know for a fact that he also designed jewelry for Black dance companies, which I think had a lot to do with his understanding of how to create jewelry that worked and functioned well with the body. Like a few other modernist jewelers, Art Smith owned and operated a jewelry studio and shop in New York City's Greenwich Village, and his work was considered wearable art. Modernist jewelry was considered a form of art, so much so that the fine arts museums at the time encouraged and collected and exhibited these jewelers' works, and Art Smith was considered a master of the craft. So how do we know what we know about Art Smith, the artist, when we began collecting his work? Well, his jewelry had appeared. As you can see, we had his jewelry that was available for us to be able to look at and examine. Collectors had been buying it, museums had been buying it, ordinary people had been buying it and still had it. He advertised his work in newspapers and magazines, and those kind of promotions were easy to find. His jewelry had been exhibited in exhibitions during his lifetime, and those records still existed. And then there was a body of work at the Brooklyn Museum donated by his former partner, Charles Russell, that contained almost everything related to his business, his store in Greenwich Village. So the store sign was there, business cards, examples of his work, drawings and designs and sale invoices, everything you would want to know about the artist and the business. But what do we know about Art Smith, the personal man? So we'll go down to the next slide. Next. I'd like to point your attention to the third image on the right there, because I think what's compelling about that image is that we're not seeing just the man, but we're also seeing that picture right at the top right there on the hand. That's a photograph of Art Smith as a youth and his younger brother who passed away before he was 3 years old. What do we know about Art Smith, the personal man, and his family? When I began to research Art Smith for the Artistry, Craftsmanship, and Creativity section of Cultural Expressions in 2014, I quickly found out that that was very little. There was tantalizing information about him and his origins and his family background. And some of it was contradictory. In some interviews, Art Smith was saying that he was born in Brooklyn in 1920, but there was information in different formats in the internet saying that he had been born in Cuba of Jamaican parents. So he was actually of Caribbean descent. There was information about his mother and his family members, that he had a mother and a father and a sister. There was information about the fact that he had done work for Black designers and dancers, but very little of that was actually substantiated in anything concrete. No primary source, no primary object that helped us actually tell that story. And it was a story that we were interested in. I mentioned before that our museum is about people. So it's important for me, particularly me who studies Black diasporic people and Black immigrant American communities and our museum by extension, to dig deeper into this information because it helps us to understand what forces helped shape him into the artist he became, what life was like for Black youth growing up, for instance, in New York City from the 1920s onwards, what challenges he and his family as immigrants may have encountered, what traditions they may have in practice that might have informed his work, and how race structured or shaped his life. So none of that information, there was, teasers here and there, mostly because people were copying information they found in other places, but none of that was grounded or substantiated in any sort of primary material or documents. And none of it was verified. So I began to dig around and see what I could identify to collect. I started that journey by reaching out to his former partner, Charles Russell. And it turned out that Charles Russell, who had lived with Art Smith during the last 10 years of his life, had held on to most of Art's family papers. Charles was also at the time working on a biography of Art Smith, which has since then been published, but even he admitted not having enough details to understand Art Smith's early life. And this is, again, because he'd only met him during the last 10 years of his life and didn't have access to the earlier time. By that time, his mother had passed away as well. I also identified two of Art Smith's good friends that were still existing, even today, one of whom had a number of materials because she herself had been wanting to write a book about him, an art book about him. And she had conducted an oral history with Arthur in the 1930s that had before now been inaccessible. So we've since brought in all of the materials that Charles Russell had at home and the material that Camille Billups, who passed away last year, also had as well. And we're currently in the process of looking through this material, figuring out what it has to tell us about his early years, figuring out if the stuff we found on the internet is accurate or not accurate or not. But there are still patches and there are holes. Among the passports and the family albums and the photographs and the address books, we're still trying to piece it all together and sort of understand where he lived and when, how his family came to the country. There are big holes, for instance, related to his father's life in particular. So as we're trying to fill in these holes, now I wanted to mention that, of course, Art Smith is already displayed in our exhibition, which is focused on his artistry, but we're still trying to fill in the background so we can tell a larger story, which I'm working on, which will become a digital project that examines his sort of his larger life. So to help us understand some of the questions we still have about Art Smith, I turn to, we're really lucky at our museum to be able to have a genealogist at our museum that we can turn to. So a critical part of the ongoing work has also involved me bringing my questions, particularly about Art Smith's earliest years and his family, to Hollis Gentry, who's going to speak next, and she's going to tell you what she's been able to substantiate and how she's been able to substantiate it. So with that, I will pass the baton to the second part of our presentation.
Thank you, Joanne. Beautiful jewelry. I just want to comment on that. Looks like it could be on the runway today. Delighted to have Hollis Gentry. She's a genealogy specialist at the National Museum of African American History and Culture, where she coordinates genealogy research services for the Smithsonian Libraries and Archives. She's a seventh generation native of Norfolk, Virginia, and her research focuses on making use of underutilized records to document 18th and 19th century African American and Afro-Native ancestry. Hollis, we welcome you.
Thank you, Lisa, for the introduction. And thank you, Joanne, for sharing with us some of the research that you conducted in relationship to the Art Smith collection. You provided examples of how curators pay special attention to the personal stories and the family background that connects to the artists and the artisans who are exhibited in our museum. I'm going to use part of your narrative in my discussion to show how I apply genealogy methodology to the work that I conduct in the museum. In the next slide, I will provide an overview of the research process. In subsequent slides, I will discuss the steps in the process that I take to provide examples of the records that I found in connection to the research on Art Smith's family that correlate with what Joanne's discovered and others have discovered. So briefly, I take the genealogy methodology to look at any story. I start with looking at the ancestors, looking for what I know, And then I move on to what I want to know. I develop a research plan based on the questions that I've asked, and that helps to guide me in terms of searching for records, searching for evidence to answer my questions. That will help guide me to the research institutions, and it will also help me to focus on the types of records that I'll consult to answer the questions. Then I'll move on to documenting whatever it is that I've looked at to keep track of it so that in the analysis process, I will be able to go back and look at whatever it is that I've discovered, if there are any discrepancies, if everything dovetails together or falls into place, then I'll be able to go back and look at the sources. And if there are any discrepancies, I can return to that source and examine it a little bit further. And then after drawing conclusions on that information, I can choose to revise the story in whichever way I want to do it. That's the personal genealogy process. However, when it comes to working with the curatorial staff, it's quite different. The part of dealing with who and what I know and who I want to learn about is different because it's not a personal ancestor, it's not a relative, it's an individual, an artisan, or whomever that the curatorial staff wants to know about. And the body of what we call what we know depends upon a lot of things. The research that the curator conducts, the resources that they use, the informants that they interact with, the records or the body of work that may have been published on any given individual. And then the questions are not initially coming from me, they're coming from the curator. What do they want to learn about this individual? What do they want me to find? And we usually will establish a set of questions, and I use that to guide me in the process of developing my research plan. And the research plan parallels with whatever they're looking for. And in the next slide, I'll show you how in the interview process, I will pull apart different parts of the narrative. And so for Art Smith, I knew that there was this body of work, a biography that was written. Joanne shared with me a lot of information, and I pulled apart names, dates, places, contextual information that I thought would help guide me in the research process. Now, this is basically an overview of the collection story, some of the key parts that Joanne shared with me, and placed him in a historical context. And it also helped me to focus on dates, places, and individuals who were connected with the family or with the artist. And the next slide, I also took that information and I created a timeline. Timelines are very useful in the research process. You can take the information that you extract from your story or your family narrative and lay it out chronologically and indicate key events, key historical eras that might influence some part of the individual's life, or they may also point to why you will find certain types of records at a certain era. I use this outline often to help me to narrow my research, to focus on the key events. And the idea is, as I continue with the research, I'll add additional dates, I might add additional information, whatever it is that comes to me. And this also helps me as a reference to use with my analysis of the research. Sometimes you'll find a date that doesn't jive with the timeline. You can add it there and pencil it in, however you want to create a timeline, and put a question mark next to it. But this is a very good tool to use with genealogical research. In exploring Art Smith's story, I knew that from Joanne, when he was born, we had an approximate date when his family immigrated from Cuba to New York. Then we had a reference to the fact that his father, James Smith, was a Garveyite, or an officer in the Universal Negro Improvement Association in New York. There was a big question about what happened to him after his arrival. We didn't know specifically when he arrived and when he may have left. We do know that he separated from the family. We don't know the circumstances. We don't know any details about that. Then the next major event in Art Smith's life was when he graduated from Cooper Union for the advancement of science and art. Cooper Union was a very unusual and non-traditional school in the sense that it provided education to a multinational, multi-ethnic, multiracial student body, and they provided scholarships for the students to study. So as I was conducting the research, I wondered whether or not Art Smith attended this school and received his training as a scholarship student, or I'm not quite sure what the situation was with his enrollment at Cooper Union. And then we find him from the 1940s to 1979 in the most active period of his life as a jeweler. It's hard to determine precisely when he started as a jeweler, but we sort of know some of the influences. And the information that Joanne provided me helped me to focus in on that period of his life and look for more contemporary sources rather than some of the earlier sources relating to his family history. And we know that he died in 1982. This information is very critical and crucial to the whole process because we have the beginning of his lifespan, the end of his lifespan. And I know that after 1982, I will probably focus on certain types of records and cease to search on other sorts of records. In other words, from 1917 to 1982, this is when he's actively living, and he himself can put, we can add events to his timeline based on his activities. Anything post 1982 is going to probably come from a derived record source. It's not going to come from primary sources. So the next slide. And as I am looking at the information that I've been provided, I've created a timeline, and then I want to look at some of the larger historical movements, historical eras. I want to be able to place the individual, the ancestor, the ancestors in a historical context. This will help me to become aware of some of the major movements, the major influences that might affect the life of this individual. For example, from the 1880s to the 1920s, it's a broad period. I'm estimating that his parents are born somewhere in the 1880s. We know that they emigrate to the US. We know that they are leaving Jamaica and they're traveling to Cuba for a reason. We're not sure about that part of the journey. We know that they lived through World War I. This will influence some part of their life. It may serve as an influence on when and where the family moved and why they moved. From the 1920s to the 1940s, they're in America. We know that there's going to be a different group of records that I'm going to have to consult. I have to look at them in the context of living in Brooklyn, living in New York City, at the height of the Harlem Renaissance, the New Negro movement, the Garveyite movement, World War II. There's a major influx of immigrants coming to the United States for multiple reasons. And there's also an influx of individuals from the African diaspora who are coming to America precisely at the time that the family is immigrating to the US. Later in his life, after he's graduated from college, he lives long enough to witness the civil rights movement. There's some indication that he is gay, and it's unclear precisely what that means in terms of whether or not he was active, or he was a protester, or he was involved in any efforts towards social justice related to being from that community. We do know that his partner is our main informant of his life. And we also know that it influenced part of his career. Not exactly how, because we don't have some of the firsthand stories, but we do know that at one point there was some discussion about perhaps his being attacked because of his orientation. I don't know the details. What that one bit of information also serves for me is a sort of clue in terms of conducting research. Not that this would prevent his sexual orientation, may not prevent him from marrying, but it might make me think in terms of, not looking for a wife and children for him. So in the next slide, I take the information, I create a timeline, I outline the historical context, the historical eras, and then I really rely on the curators to tell me what they want to know. And we have a discussion back and forth. Sometimes it may be a matter of receiving an email and it's very to the point. I want a date or I want a death date. Sometimes it involves an email, a phone discussion, and an in-person meeting where we discuss back and forth what they want to know, what I found in a preliminary process of conducting the research. And then we go back and forth and settle on something. In Joanne's case, we settled on about 6 questions that I sort of grouped together into about 5. She was interested in learning about whether or not we could document or verify his birth in Cuba. She also wanted to be able to verify when the family immigrated to the US from Cuba. We wanted to determine whether or not Arthur even initiated the process of naturalization. Was there any documentation and where might one find that? Then Joanne was interested in determining whether or not any newspapers documented the earliest years of his business, when it opened or whenever it was established. Finally, there were a lot of questions about James Smith, Art's father. We have a little bit of information in terms of his association with the UNIA and that he was a Garveyite. In Art's obituary, in one of his obituaries, it mentioned his mother and it mentioned his father as an old Garveyite. And that's about the only information that we had about him. So in this process, I used the questions to help guide me towards the sources that I wanted to search. Since we were dealing with this process during the pandemic, I knew that I was going to be restricted to searching for digitized, virtually available records and information. I knew that the focus had to be international in scope. I kept in my mind the possibility that I could access records beyond the US. Those in Cuba, Jamaica, or even the UK. I wasn't certain about the availability of these records, but I did outline them in terms of seeking the sources. I knew that I was going to, or I was possibly going to find the most information from 2 major sources, virtual sources, which would be ancestry.com, which is a major genealogy database, and familysearch.org, which is a free database, a free resource for genealogical records. Ancestry and family search complement one another. And this is for the researchers in the audience. Local libraries tend to have library editions of Ancestry, but it's really based on a paid subscription. It's quite expensive for the international access. It runs up somewhere close to about $300 or $400 for an annual subscription. And typically what we suggest is that you contact a local library if they have the subscription and use those resources to conduct this research. Family Search has a global thrust, a global interest in gathering genealogical records. And they tend to also have more records of international origin than does Ancestry. One of the other things the other features that Family Search has, and this was something that Kenyatta mentioned in her earlier presentation on this research process, is that they also have research wikis. And what those are list of resources that have been arranged geographically and chronologically. And these records will help you to determine or provide an overview of the types of resources that are available for any given era, any given area. And they drill down to individual towns if that information is available, published sources, other online sources. I use the Family Search Research Wikis quite often. And generally when I start the process, I'll turn to those in order to survey what's available and help me determine whether or not I'll focus on resources at Ancestry or Family Search. It just helps the process to move along a little bit faster. One of the other resources that I use is google.com. When I don't know anything about the people that I'm researching or the subjects that I'm researching, I'll use Google to find answers. You can plug in a question. How do I find a birth certificate from a given era? How do I find information about a historical era, an event? You will also find access to published sources that have been digitized by Google and Google Books. There's a wealth of information that one can find. I often use Google when I have a lot of research challenges and I just need to dip into another resource and I may not know the terminology or the jargon. And sometimes I'll find a resource and Google will provide me with that bit of information that moves me along the way. You can also find digitized newspapers through Google. It is one of the resources that I use at what I call the 3 a.m. desperate search for information, and Google never fails me. In Kenyatta's discussion at the earlier session, she examined the process of a Bermudian immigrating to the United States. She outlined already the different sources for researching immigration, the passenger lists, the naturalization records, the immigration records. But the example that she used was someone who was well documented, who intended on becoming a United States citizen, who actually completed the process. Arthur Smith on our end never completed that process. And essentially he lived his life in the US as a resident alien. And that's the terminology that we used. Joanne wanted to find out if he ever initiated the process, because she did learn in amongst the family papers that there was evidence that his mother went through the process and his sister went through the process. Next slide, please. So once I established everything that I needed to put it in place, then I started having fun. So I turned to Ancestry.com because I knew that it had the largest source of immigration records that I could easily access. And lo and behold, because I had the date, at least the year, I was able to locate Arthur, his mother, and his sister Ina when they arrived. I discovered that they came into the US on the ship Siboney, and they arrived on August 3rd, 1920. What was key to this whole part was not on the first page where they're listed, but on the second page. And I say key to my research, which was the address, the identity of the father, James Smith, where he was living at 101 Lawrence Street in Brooklyn, New York. And also it indicated, and this was a little bit of conflicting information, they were admitted for 5 years residency. And initially, the clerk indicated that they were not, there was no intention of their wanting to become citizens, but then it looks like, he crossed that out and indicated that they did. So by locating this record, I realized that the father had already arrived and established himself and had a permanent address. And so I launched a search for him in an earlier year. So it was anything pre-August 3rd. And because he had a very common name, James Smith, I thought, oh my goodness. And I tell you, I spent quite a long amount of time looking through every James Smith. Then I narrowed it down to James Smiths who were leaving Havana, Cuba, and arriving in the United States. Initially, I found someone who arrived in Florida, and I thought that was my guy. But going back to my timeline, looking at the information that I had, I questioned that and put a little red flag on that and said, I'm not sure this is a guy. And so I searched again, and lo and behold, I found him using the address. So that cut down some of the work. And I share this with you because if you're searching for an ancestor with a very common name, something similar to James Smith, you might want to search for that individual in connection with some unique information. And in this instance, it was his address in Brooklyn. So in the next slide, I used the information from that passenger list, and I could not read all of the information because it was a very poor image. And I want to share with you the importance of looking at multiple versions of the same record or different versions of different types or different formats of the same type of information. And in this instance, I started with the passenger ship list at the ancestry.com website. I turned to Family Search because they tend to typically have cleaner and brighter and clearer images of some of the records that are have been digitized from some of the microfilmed resources, and they spend a little bit more time cleaning up the images, and they also have tools that you can use to lighten up, brighten up, and clarify the images. And here I found index cards based on the passenger list in the previous slide. And again, I was able to identify James Smith at the 101 Lawrence Street address. But the card also provided a little bit more information and a few more clues. It identified Mary's place of birth as Chapelton, Jamaica. And it also indicated and identified the name of a friend in Cuba, Mabel Morrow in Havana, Cuba. That's providing me with a clue to research somewhere down the line. It indicated that she arrived with $140 in her pocket and she paid for her passage. It also identified at the very bottom that she was about 5 feet tall, gave her physical description, and just above that, it indicated that they intended to they were headed to a permanent residence of the father. And just below that, it identified Ina, her daughter, and Arthur as a 2-year-old. And Ina received a card of her own, which reflected again on the information on her mother and her father. What this helped to do was provide additional evidence to support the family. This is a cluster of the Smith family, and it's anchoring them in Brooklyn, just as the narrative did, the narrative that we have for Art Smith. So in the next slide, I searched a little bit further. Remember, I had the sheet of the historical context. So I knew that Art came of age during World War II. And typically in the United States, all males had to at least register for the draft. It didn't necessarily mean that they served in the military, but it did mean that they had to register. And although we know or we believe that he may not have been a naturalized citizen, I guessed that he would possibly show up in these records, and certainly he did. And what this record provided us with was a gold mine of information. It gave us his birth date. It also specified where in Cuba he was born, and it identified his mother. And beyond that, it was beautiful in the sense that it provided us with multiple addresses, additional clues on how to track him. It's showing us that his life was somewhat transient for reasons that are unknown. It connected him to Harlem, where we know he worked at some point. It showed that he was unemployed, and it also provided us with his signature. And these clues might help us later on with the research, but I wasn't certain. In the next slide, I also dug a little bit deeper. I knew where he was educated, And on the Ancestry website, I searched through the school yearbooks and discovered that he was, I found a photograph of him that I don't think anyone else has discovered in connection with his research. And it's important when you're conducting research virtually to not just focus on the one record or the one place where you find the individual that you're seeking. It behooves you to search the whole source if you can. In this example, there was a yearbook, and I looked through all the pages and discovered him as a member of a club. It didn't identify what club, but there he is with a group of some of his colleagues or students of the time. They appeared to be older adults, and there's no clue in the narrative that was in the yearbook to indicate what they were doing. I'm guessing they were art students. I searched further in the yearbook and found a roster of the seniors who graduated in 1940, and it provided us with additional documentation about where he was living at the time when he was a student at Cooper Union. In the next slide, I turned to the federal census. We typically, for anyone who's living during the years where the federal census exists, we'll start with the most contemporary census and work backwards. I know that Arthur and his family didn't arrive until 1920. Chances are they weren't going to be recorded because of the proximity to perhaps the date when the census was taken. But I did know, based on all of the documents that preceded that, his family was living in, or he was living in Brooklyn in 1940. I found them as a family unit. Then I searched earlier to determine, whether or not they're still in that same area. And I discovered that they were still as the same family unit with a roomer. The most glaring part of this discovery was that the father was not present in either of the census records, which led me to question where he might have been. I speculated that perhaps he may have worked in some capacity that took him away from the home, or perhaps that he was no longer in the US at that time, or at least not with the family. So in looking at the information from 1930 to 1940, it was pretty consistent in terms of the structure of the household. The 1930 census identified Arthur as being born in Cuba, and his mother and sister and the roomer as being Jamaican born. By 1940, when the question changed and the information recorded changed slightly, there was a slight differentiation made between where Arthur was born, which was in the West Indies, and his mother and sister were born in the British West Indies, which supports the Jamaican birth and the association with that place. In the next slide, Joanne asked if I could find information about his business in Harlem, and if there was any evidence of his appearing in any newspapers. Well, I searched through some digital newspapers and the social columns, and I found multiple references to him, little snippets of information. And here I discovered in the New York Tribune a snippet that was written by a columnist that indicated Art's previous association with his mentor, Winifred Mason, and that he had opened his shop in the village. And this dates to roughly about, I think, a year or so after his business started. And I think it's more around 1946, but I couldn't find anything earlier. But I was happy to at least discover some evidence that linked him to the narrative that we already had. And then the next slide, I still had this desire to document James Smith based on the information that Joanne provided. I didn't have anything else other than the immigration, the passenger list. And so I thought back to my historical context list, and I realized that he was old enough to have been drafted during World War I. And there, based on the address that he provided for the permanent residence, I was able to locate him. When I searched simply for James Smith, I had a very difficult time trying to locate him. And it took me hours to look through literally a lot of individuals. It was like thousands of men with that name. And you would think that there wouldn't be that many in Brooklyn. And yes, there were. So I looked at the clues in this record and discovered that he was employed by the Arbuckle brothers. Didn't know anything about them, and I knew that I needed to conduct a little bit more research. I was able to, you know, discover that he had another research in association with him, a friend who lived at 286 Atlantic Avenue in Brooklyn. And by virtue of the fact that he signed his name on there, I knew that he was literate. So these key pieces of information, you know, I noted and I added them to my list of what we know about James Smith. In the next slide, I reviewed everything that I had based on the questions that Joanne asked of me, the information she provided. I looked for correlations, looked for discrepancies, and was able to provide answers to about most of the information. What I couldn't find was whether or not Arthur became a naturalized citizen. And as I was reviewing the information, an idea occurred to me, and this is pure speculation, in that as I was looking over his lifespan, and I was trying to figure out reasons as to why he didn't become a citizen, why his mother did, and why his sister did, I realized that he was born in Cuba, and that chances are he may have had difficulties in locating a copy of his birth record, or by the time that he was interested in applying for citizenship, the US-Cuba relations had deteriorated to the point that he couldn't, that he could not apply for citizenship. He couldn't get a copy of the record. And based on all of the clues that I gathered as I was looking through the records, I came up with a list of the next steps. And the next slide I'm gonna move on to. Briefly, I located a newspaper that identified his mother and sister when they were advertising or looking for employment. I knew that his father was associated with the UNIA. So I know that that's going to be an area where I need to conduct additional research. He was a Garveyite. I learned that the Negro World was published by Marcus Garvey. And in some of the columns, they identified the officers who were associated with UNIA. They also included information about laborers who were migrating from one place to the other who may have been associated with the association. I also discovered that James Smith's employer, the Arbuckle brothers, were based in Brooklyn, and that may have been the impetus for his leaving Cuba and coming to Brooklyn. And in this final slide, we're going to look at a very quick video. There's no audio to it. The family arrived in Brooklyn on August 3rd, 1920. This was 2 days following this momentous parade when Africans from the diaspora, from the Caribbean, from Africa, from all over the United States who were associated with the UNIA, traveled to Harlem, and they held a month-long convention. And I tried to imagine what the experience was like for Arthur and his family to arrive in the United States and see, and to go to this part of the country. They're going to New York and arriving there probably with a lot of other individuals from the Caribbean, and how impressive that must have been, and how it may have influenced them into thinking that they had made the correct decision on immigrating to the US. And that concludes my presentation, and Camila will pick up from where I left off. Thank you.
Thank you, Hollis. Well, yeah, when you go into depth on the name and then having some unique elements, I think everybody who has encountered and developed their own family research in Bermuda knows that we have a lot of name repetition and name changing. And so you're really hitting the very interesting note for all of us here in Bermuda. All right, let's keep turning over. We'll go to Camila Stinnett. Camila is a genealogy reference assistant in the Robert F. Smith Explorer Family History Center at the National Museum of African American History and Culture. Her research and professional interests include slavery, Reconstruction, and the Freedmen's Bureau. She holds an MA in Museum Studies. Delighted to have you, Camila.
Hi, thank you. I'm glad to be here. So we're going to switch gears a little bit and start talking about the ways that our museum engages community, and we do that largely by embracing genealogy. So the woman pictured here, her name is Elaine Thompson, and she donated her ancestors' freedom papers to the museum. Her great-great-great-grandfather's name was Joseph Trammell, and he was enslaved in Virginia. And in the 1850s, he gained his freedom. And in Virginia and in much of the South at that time, free African Americans had to have proof of that freedom, and that existed in the form of freedom papers or certificates of freedom. And so his family preserved those papers across the generations. And what's interesting about this object is not just that the papers endured over time, but also that he himself built this tin to protect his freedom, in essence, to keep the papers safe. And so that oral history was passed down throughout the family, through the family over generations as well. Her story is really important because it highlights one of the avenues that the museum uses when we're engaging communities, and that is to use genealogy and to use oral history, not only to augment the exhibitions themselves, but to forge personal connections between the museum and our visitors and our audiences. And so Elaine Thompson was involved in the process that the Hollis just laid out. So the research team for the Slavery and Freedom exhibition, in which her ancestors' papers are displayed, she was interviewed as part of their research process, and she helped that research team identify him in some additional records at the local level. She has since passed away, but she was able to experience the museum being open. And we are very grateful to her and we're glad to have known her and had her help and assistance in telling her ancestor story in the museum exhibition. And her story kind of hints at something larger that the museum does, in that it does not kind of paint a shrine to any one person. It really is a museum that tells the everyday person's story and views American history through the lens of African American people. And so approaching our exhibitions by way of personal objects, by way of personal stories is one way that we are able to do that. And another thing that guides the way that we approach genealogy, I think, is really summed up with this quote by our founding director and the current secretary of the Smithsonian, when he says, "I think we need to recognize that if we can make history personal and find the connections with the public, we'll be able to help them see the broader issues. Anyone who's seen the greatest interest in genealogy recognizes there's a thirst for history." And that really does get at our approach to how we approach genealogy in the Family History Center. And it's one of the things that led to the establishment of this Family History Center. So the Robert F. Smith Explore Your Family History Center opened when the museum opened in August 2016. And the center is designed to help people begin their family history journey and to understand and learn the basics of researching African American history and genealogy. We also work with Black people from across the diaspora. So we're not just focused on the African American story or the African American narrative. We have worked with people from all over the world, but a lot of our international researchers are coming to us from the Caribbean. So nearly 70% of all of the research that is conducted in the Family History Center that is not for the United States is for the Caribbean. So the Family History Center staff is really invested and knows the importance and the connections between African American histories and Caribbean histories. So we engage with communities in the Family History Center in two ways. The first is to really create a personal visitor experience. And the way that we do that on a daily basis is via our genealogy research sessions. So before the pandemic, visitors could come to the museum. The center is located on the museum's second floor, and they could take part in a session with a staff member. And that session would either be a one-on-one session or a session with other museum visitors in a group. And the sessions are really designed to help people get started on their genealogy journey and understand the basics of researching this history. In those sessions, we do use the databases that Hollis outlined earlier. So we use Ancestry Library Edition, FamilySearch.org, Fold3, and some newspaper databases as well. So we really want to kind of make their experience to the museum personal. And one of the great things about having a genealogy center at the museum is that it really drives the connection between your personal and your family history to the broader historical context. And so because folks are coming to the museum to kind of learn about the American story from the African American experience, they're also able, when they come to us and start their family history research, to situate their own family histories in that historical context as well. The other way that we engage our communities are with direct community outreach, and we do that through a variety of programs and initiatives. So about once a month, the Family History Center will host a public program on a variety of genealogy related topics. And so in the past, we've done topics and programs on DNA, using DNA to do your own genealogy research. We've done programs looking at emancipation practices and celebrations from various regions of the United States. We've done programs on foodways and food culture and that history and how to engage that when you're doing your family history research. So we really do try to hit at a bunch of different areas that bring genealogy to the core. We also have community partnerships. So those are partnerships and programs that are ongoing. So an example of this would be the Family History Centers has a really close relationship with a senior citizen home that is in the DC area. And the Family History Center does, I think they meet once a month with the folks that are at that center, helping them with their genealogy research. They do kind of bite-sized presentations on a variety of subjects as well. And they've been doing that with that group for a little over a year. And so we do things like that with senior citizens, organizations, community outreach groups, and schools, so that we are kind of reaching all different areas of our communities with our collaborations. Another way that we reach out to communities, we can't be everywhere since we are located in Washington, D.C., but we want to make sure that our resources and our expertise are available to as many people as possible. And so part of doing that is to make sure that other institutions can benefit from the resources that we have. So we do have certain collaborations with a variety of institutions that are both in the United States and outside of the United States, helping them take a look at their personal collections and see how they can harness that to provide genealogy services to their immediate communities that they serve. And I'll let Doretha talk about this in a little bit when we get there, but the Family History Center is very heavily involved in the museum's community curation project. The Family History Center is situated kind of organizationally in the museum in the Center for the Digitization and Preservation of African American History and Culture. And so that center does some wonderful work, and Doretha will talk about this, engaging directly in communities and going to those communities around the country. And the Family History Center is a part of all of that. And so when we travel with the Center for Digitization, we are putting on genealogy workshops where folks can kind of get the same information and resources that they would if they were able to come visit us at the museum. We're also working right alongside people as they're getting their personal objects and their family heirlooms digitized, to provide resources on how to care for those objects, on how to conduct research with those objects using some of the methodologies that Hollis outlined before. And so, once again, why museums and why genealogy? The reason why genealogy is such a perfect fit for museums is that it makes history personal. And so it really does put your personal history into historical context. So if you are someone who has not done any genealogy research, utilizing the resources of a museum or cultural institution would be a great benefit for you. Because as you begin that research, or as you continue that research, if you haven't started, that institution can help you and guide you as you conduct your search. And it also, we hope and we believe that genealogy helps, because of that, cultivate an interest in studying history at large. So I'll turn it over to Doretha.
Thank you very much. Camila, that is a really important plug for the
I think we just lost Lisa there for a second. Just check in with her. Okay, I will lead to the next one while I wait for Lisa to just come back in. So Doretha, yeah, thanks Camila for your presentation. That was great. And I think what Lisa was going to say was that it really ties in the importance of museums and genealogy and the role that seeing personal stories in museum settings plays in understanding wider historical context. So thank you again for sharing that. Doretha is the director of the Robert F. Smith Center for the Digitization and Curation of African American History at the National Museum of African American History and Culture. Dr. Williams has expertise in early 20th century Black women's history, African American literature and literary history, community archives, digital humanities, and cultural institutional leadership. Doretha, thank you for joining us today, and I will hand it over to you now for your presentation.
Awesome. Thank you, Deb, for that wonderful introduction, and thank you to my colleague from the Smithsonian. A special thank you to Camila for setting us up to talk more about community interactions and community engagement. I'm going to introduce to you our community curation program and how we embed ourselves in different communities and with different institutions to help digitally preserve collections as well as present programs while we're in these different communities. So I'll go ahead and have Camila run the video for us.
Yeast rolls were, you know, the thing in our family, and I thought it had died with her. And so when it showed up, you know, in this box, when it showed up in this box, I was very happy. I was very, very happy. My name is Lisa Daniels, and I brought Granny's recipes. My grandmother is Shirley Hurd. She passed away in 2015. So I asked him, I said, does Granny happen to have any aprons? And he said, no. He said, there are no aprons, but there's that old recipe box sitting on the counter in there in the kitchen. And I'm like, what? And he handed this to me, and I wept. I was blown away.
Every individual, every family, every community has a story. At the National Museum of African American History and Culture, we want to give individuals, families, and communities the opportunity to share their stories with current and future generations. And through the Community Curation program, we strive to do just that.
Ready?
The innovative program, hosted by the Center for the Digitization and Curation of African American History, invites the public to have their personal flat items and audiovisual materials digitized by our expert staff. photographs and tintypes, recipes and diplomas, audio recordings, and home videos. These are the things we hold dear, and taken together, our individual stories define our collective history. But these items have shelf lives that are shorter than one would think. By digitizing community materials and sharing the stories behind them, we can ensure that everyday American history is preserved. To bring the Community Curation program to life, the museum collaborates with archiving institutions across the country. In 2019, the museum worked with the Black Metropolis Research Consortium and its member institutions to host community curation in Chicago.
I started my work as an oral historian with family oral history, so I'm very impressed with what you've done here.
At each stop, we hold free digitization sessions, workshops on genealogy and preservation, and many programs exploring the history and culture of the local community. In Chicago, those interactions led us to stories that were at once incredibly universal and deeply personal. And the Center for the Digitization and Curation of African American History is grateful that communities continue to trust us to preserve and share these treasures.
And when I heard that the opportunity to digitize all of this stuff and keep it in one place was available, I could not come. So here I am with what remains of that part of my history, and I get to share this with my granddaughter and my grandson.
I will unmute myself. Thank you so much, Camila. I want to go into talk more detail about our community curation. As you saw, we were in Chicago in 2019, where we were there for a month, just embedded in that community to digitize collections as well as present different types of programs and genealogies. But what we really try to do when we do community curation is to engage with communities and bring that personalized museum experience to our partners and different families that we interact with when we're on the road. And I wanted to show you a few images and offer you a few stories of what we have done while we're on the road. We were in Baltimore with our pilot project in 2017, and then we were in Denver, Colorado in 2018, and then of course in 2019, we were in Chicago, and we're making ways to New Orleans once it is safe to do so. But for the community curation program, we open it up to people in the community, families, and institutions to bring their items in to be digitally preserved. And the images below here give an example of several wonderful stories that we've encountered. You see the gentleman in the plastic tub going through a set of papers. This is while we were in Denver, Colorado, and his name is Mr. Gray. And Mr. Gray came to us and had several tubs, plastic tubs full of material. And he just said, look, these were in my parents' basement for years. I have no idea what's in these tubs, and they're just their personal papers. And as he's digging around and he invites all of us to go through all of these plastic tubs, he reaches in and he pulls out this bundle of letters. And the great thing about this is we actually get the exact moment when he realizes what he's found. And you see his face is just full of excitement. He actually found his parents' love letters in the 40s while his father was in the military, as you can see in that picture in the far right, military mail from his father to his mother. And we immediately stopped going through because this becomes a very personal experience. And he is just so excited and reading the letters, and he invites us to read the letters with him. So we were just honored and just found it a great privilege to do so with him and read these wonderful letters. And the love letters were full of expressions of, I miss you, I cannot wait to see you and the kids, and I Think of You Nightly. Just a very wonderful experience of reading about his family, his parents' relationship, and how they were separated and found writing these letters to each other to keep in touch, and the love that they had for their family. So it was a great experience, not only to interact with him individually, but to get the story of a Black family and this interference of military service and being away from the family and what have you, and then the expressions of love that this man was able to see his parents have. So we ended up digitizing the collection of letters, and he was able to share them with his kids and his grandchildren, as well as their surviving siblings. So the experience of working with him, but also filling in these stories and histories of his family, and in turn, filling out more history and more stories of Black families. And so it was a wonderful experience. To the far left, you see a picture of his mother. That was a story from Denver. In the second from the left, this photo is very important as well. This was also a photo that we encountered in Denver in 2018. And a young woman brought in this photo, the only thing she brought in. And the photo is of her great-great-grandfather. I'm not quite sure how many generations, but the young man is seated in the middle. And she begins to talk about that he was in Boston, was taken between 1915 and 1917. They had found the photographer and all of that. And so this is the ancestor. As I'm looking, my eyes just try to drift up to the top left hand of the photo, and it's a clear picture of Elaine Locke. And I totally lost my cool and started going, oh my gosh, that's Elaine Locke. And she's wondering who this person is. And so we spoke about the history of Elaine Locke. He was born in the 1880s. He is a well-known philosopher and writer, African-American culture. He is said to be the dean of the Harlem Renaissance, and he is the first Black recipient of Rhodes Scholar. So this was a wonderful find, not just for her to understand more of history, her family's history, but this all wonderful photo of all these Black men, including Elaine Locke. And then she goes out to talk on the phone to her father, who has never really told her much about the photo. And all of a sudden he's giving her all this information. And turns out, going back to Hollis's presentation, that this is a group of the UNIA and a group of Garveyite men, and who were involved in the early 20th century in Boston. So this was just another encounter where we were able to help fill in the history for a family, and then not only fill in that personal history, but look at this more national narrative of Black life. So there was incredible experiences, and this is just the experience we had in Denver. The video showed you experiences that we also had in Chicago. Next slide. In addition to working with families, we work with institutions and working to make sure their collections are digitized and preserved. On the far left, you see Mr. Dino Robinson, who is the director of the Shorefront Legacy Collection in Evanston, Illinois, right north of Chicago. Up top, Terry Nelson, she's holding a pressed layout of a newspaper talking about the community curation in Denver, and she is the senior archivist at the Blair Caldwell African American Research Library in Denver, Colorado. And that bottom photo is from our Chicago time, and working with the DuSable Museum. So these are also interactions that we have with institutions to make sure their collections are digitized. And actually, Dino Robinson just uploaded on their website for the Shorefront Legacy, the digitized collections, oral histories that we did for them back in 2019. Next slide, please. So part of the community curation project, of course, is working to digitize these collections, but also to nurture institutional relationships, making sure that our institutions know that we are in it for the long haul, making sure that they know that we have multiple touch points with them. When we were in Denver in 2018, our other traveling project Saving Our African American Treasures, also went to Denver and worked with the Blair Caldwell African American Research Library. So it's a way to say we are the Smithsonian. We are working to support communities, but we're doing it through different projects and different timelines. We are a full 100% service. We engage communities to make sure we digitize these collections and make sure they're preserved for families and histories. Practicing mindfulness. When we arrive in different cities and different communities, we make sure we understand the local politics. We try to make sure we understand what organizations are going through at the time, to make sure that we're being a benefit and not a burden. And finally, funding the mission, making sure that institutions know that we're there for them financially as well. And that goes for purchasing equipment, managing the programs that we're working while we're in the city. So this is all a part of serving the communities, not just on the local level with the families and institutions, but making sure that our communities and institutions know that we are with them and for them and supporting them in the long haul. And that's all a part what community curation is. And we hope to continue as soon as it is safe to do so. And our next city will be New Orleans. I don't know if we have time for questions, and we kind of went to the end there.
Yeah, we're close to the hour, but I think what we were able to see when starting to drill this all down, and as the four of you've crafted a very well-connected, thoughtful presentation. I want to thank you so much for doing so, and also by connecting it to the previous presentations. I'm grateful for your threading like that. I think what we start to see, though, is just like the experience is of diving into personal research, it takes time. I wish that we weren't pressed for time, and that in our time zone we're running up to 7 o'clock, and I know people are maybe having to drop off because of other responsibilities. As we have put into the chat, I think what would be best is if you have a question, to post it now. And what we'll do is we'll get back to you personally with an answer. You can, of course, also write to us at the museum. Dr. Deb Atwood's email is the word curator at nmb.bm, or you could also just write to info@nmb.bm, and we'll get those questions. I'm really hoping that we can come to Washington, and that we can come and as a group walk your work, walk and experience your hard work, this patient, very selfless work that you're doing to craft this museum experience. And I couldn't have worded it better from Camila, that your outreach has made the history personal. And as a result, you are not just showing the narrative of your community, of your nation, you are also engaging them at the same time. And I just think that while all museums effort to do that, we can see that and feel and sense your very hard and patient work. And we know that the project for the National Museum of Bermuda is a challenge. We've got over 80,000 objects, and continuing to do that research and dive down with these objects and make sure that we tell our own histories and the developing diversity of Bermuda's history. So all of this program is feeding into ultimately a call for action, a culminating community outreach curated project. And we will speak more about that very soon. But I'm hoping that from this, people are inspired to look in closets, attics, recipe books. I mean, some really wonderful examples of objects that are treasures. And the Bible as well. Like, it's really interesting to look back and to see these photographs that in documents. So all of this has been extremely inspiring. We're coming up to the hour. I do want to remind everyone, please, to complete the survey. It's been presented at the top and bottom in the chat. And that your feedback helps us to know what we're doing is good work. And if we can improve for the next presentation, please tell us what we should be doing. Before I close, I want to make sure that, where are we at? We've got 1 minute. I'm just looking into the chat, and we've got a lot of comments, which is terrific, and positive comments. Does anyone have a final word? Any final tips? Because you've given so much advice and suggestion on how to do good patient work. Okay. All right. Well, we're coming to my clock is about to switch to 7 o'clock. So again, thank you everybody for participating. I know that we have participants from around the world. Thank you for joining us here in Bermuda. Delighted to be a museum partner with the Smithsonian Institution. Woo! Thank you all so much for everything you've done to present with us today. Thank you, team behind the scenes. And let's hope to make sure that we stay connected, follow our progress through the nmb.bm website. Also, of course, we're on Instagram. And we really look forward to everyone's participation as we go forward to crafting our story in June, and then ultimately the call for action that will come later this year. So thank you all again.